Hi, everyone. I'm Matt Schultz with the Sustainable Phosphorus Alliance, and thanks for joining us for Phosphorus Science Now. Today's topic is about the Florida Everglades. The Everglades are a National Heritage Site of profound ecological and economic importance to the United States and indeed to the world. The Everglades today are about half the size of their original footprint. Much of that land was drained to make way for agriculture and for urban development over the last century and a half or so. That development has led to increasing loads of phosphorus entering the Everglades over the years. This phosphorus imperils the ecosystem that remains. Years of hard-fought policy and technological battles have been waged in this region, and those efforts have produced policy and practice changes and large-scale infrastructure projects that have led to various levels of success in reducing phosphorus loads and protecting this unique ecosystem. We're joined here today by Quinn Zacharias, a graduate student at Yale and lead author of the Restoration Ecology paper entitled "The Past, Present, and Potential Future of Phosphorus Management in the Florida Everglades." Well, hi, Quinn. Welcome to Phosphorus Science Now. Thanks for joining us. Can you go ahead and walk us through your presentation?
Yeah, sure. The Florida Everglades, it's the largest subtropical wetland in North America. It's on the most southern tip of the state of Florida. You can see in the picture on the upper right. It's about 7,800 square miles, and the current ecosystem is about 5,000 years old. About half of the Everglades is remaining, and about half of it was actually drained to make way for land development for agricultural and residential zoning. So let's jump into it. The degradation of the Florida Everglades. So Florida has always been a hotbed for tourism and development. Since about the 1880s, you had early industrialists like Hamilton Diston that wanted to drain the Florida Everglades to make way for what we now know as Miami, and that was founded in 1896. So over the coming decades after that, there was more and more development, and they had created a dam on the on this Lake Okeechobee, and they had put this giant levee across it. And there was a hurricane that hit in 1928, and 2,000 people died. The levee broke and 2,000 people died. This was reminiscent of New Orleans in 1927. So there was a big push to almost completely drain the Everglades. And so you had a couple different acts, like the River and Harbor Act, which was a manifestation of the tragedy in 1928. And then you had the creation of the South Florida Water Management District, which at first their sole job was to keep the land dry, keep the water off of the land. And then through the 1930s to the 1960s, they took that earth levee and turned it into the Herbert Hoover Dike. And they continued to build flood control projects ever since. So you had this massive draining of the Florida Everglades. And in addition, we had phosphorus pollution. And phosphorus was put on on agriculture and on lawns, and it slipped into the ecosystem, causing a lot of degradation and harm. So there was a book in 1947 written by Marjorie Stoneman Douglas called The River of Grass, to sort of shed light on the beauty of the Everglades and that it should be restored. And then so in the year 2000, the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, signed by President Bill Clinton, was originally created to fix the water management, to get water flowing properly, and to help with nutrient pollution, specifically phosphorus running off from agriculture and sugarcane. So this was going to be on a 40 to 60-year timeline and cost about $8 billion with numerous projects. It's since expanded. I believe it was now over 20 billion to complete the whole thing. I have a figure in a later slide. But here's sort of the master plan. This will hopefully make more sense of the dynamic. So let's start from the top of the watershed. You'll see the Kissimmee River, which flows into Lake Okeechobee. Now let me back up. Florida is defined by its waters. So most of the state was a wetland. That is, it's defined by water. And so they had these massive drainage projects. And so what you can see is you'll see under Lake Okeechobee, you'll see this tan region. So that's all been dried for farmland. And then if you look to the right, you'll see the development of South Florida, which extends all the way down to the Florida Keys in the most southeastern region. That whole area between Miami, Palm Beach, Fort Lauderdale has been dried and developed for residential lots. And so you'll see that water flows down the Kissimmee River into Lake Okeechobee. And around Lake Okeechobee, you'll see this black perimeter. There's the levee or a dike that covers most of this lake. And so there are two rivers that lead both east, which is the St. Lucie River, and west, which is the Caloosahatchee River. And then water has been redirected through canals through that tan region, which is the EAA, the Everglades Agriculture Area, down to, you see that red line? So past that red line where you go into the protected Everglades system. And so within this system, you'll have water, WCA, which is Water Conservation Area 1, Water Conservation Area 2, and 3. So these are essentially giant pools that hold water, but they're still functioning as wetlands today and are home to many environmentally sensitive species and endangered habitats. And that eventually there is still a trickle of water that flows into Everglades National Park, as well as Big Cypress National Park. So, like I said, there is a variety of animals. In fact, this is the only place where you could find alligators and crocodiles coexisting within the same geographic region, which is pretty interesting. And so when it comes to removing phosphorus, right? So now you have an overview of the land. Within this context, there was a pretty bold plan that was set out. There's something called a treatment wetland, which as water passes through this man-made wetland, the plants and the different organisms within this construction would uptake phosphorus and other nutrients from the water. So you have a lot of water passing through the system that is high in phosphorus, about 10 times what it should be. They say that phosphorus levels before development was about lower than 10 parts per billion. And now you'll find used to find concentrations of over 100 parts per billion. And now through this plan, it's gotten better. We're going to talk about that in a second. But the real workhorse is these treatment wetlands, commonly known as stormwater treatment areas, STAs. So these are in green, so you'll see them. So as water passes through those canals, it will eventually make its way into the stormwater treatment areas. And then at the other end of those areas, water will come out, hopefully purified, almost an order of magnitude from what it was. Now, the thing about the Everglades is that it is a ecosystem that pulses seasonally. So that is, it gets a lot of rain in one season and then it's dry the other season. So you have this constant fluctuation of the water elevation over throughout the year. But stormwater treatment areas require a steady, smooth flow of water. And so in order to account for that, in order to equalize that, they had these things called flow equalization basins. Now, these are essentially large reservoirs that can hold water and feed a continuous stream of water into the stormwater treatment areas so that it can flow out the other side. In other words, this is essentially a machinery to take water from Lake Okeechobee, clean it, store it, and pass it into the Everglades as needed. And when they first developed this back in the 1990s and early 2000s, this was very cutting edge stuff. And people weren't sure if it was going to work. It was sort of a gamble. And these projects were on the order of billions of dollars. So was it successful? Well, it was. And we're going to talk about that, in a few minutes. But let's back up and let's talk about the sort of how we came to understand the phosphorus, our understanding of phosphorus within the Everglades. So the first paper was published in 1953 by Howard T. Odom that speculated that P being phosphorus, could cause eutrophication in Florida waters. By the 1970s, you had different scientists in the Florida Everglades that were realizing that normally this ecosystem would have what's called oligotrophic, so that is low levels of phosphorus within this ecosystem. And then so by the year 2000, the South Florida Water Management District correlated cattail encroachment with phosphorus levels over 10 parts per billion. And at the same time, Duke University had a contract with the state of Florida to independently do research about phosphorus management, and they created a CART, which is just it's a statistical framework to sort of study how when you dose microplots with different amounts of phosphorus to see when they start becoming eutrophic. So they had different microplots and they would dose them with phosphorus with different levels of concentrations of phosphorus, and they thought that the threshold of when the water would become eutrophic was between 17 and 22 parts per billion. So there was a lot of debate. Eventually, the research group from Duke wound up sort of tailoring in their estimate to 13 to 15 parts per billion upon further study, but this still caused a lot of sort of controversy and dispute. But here we go. So you'll see these are the different thresholds. So this is a probability. What you'll see here is these are probabilities of when eutrophication, of where the threshold of where eutrophication begins. So you'll see here that the blue line, that is predicted by the work at the South Florida Water Management District. Then you'll see the 2003 study by Duke, which is in red, and then you'll see the Duke's group in 2007, where they'd sort of tightened their probability bands of where they think the threshold exists. However, there was still a fundamental disagreement. And so what happened? So the state of Florida had to go through all of this science and sort of figure out what are we going to do? And what are we going to pick? We have this disagreement in science, so where are we going to set our standards? So in 1988, the Miccosukee tribe had sued the federal government because they were letting phosphorus-laden water flow into their tribal lands. And so eventually they wound up, the federal government and the Miccosukee tribe joined forces and then sued the South Florida Water Management District. Now this was eventually led to a consent decree in 1992, where they said that no one was at fault, but that standards would be created. So there was sort of this impetus and push from legal action that sort of made legislators realize, okay, what does the standard need to be? So then in 1994, they had the Florida Forever Act, where they said that 10 parts per billion, they didn't say that 10 parts per billion should be the standard, but they said that whatever the concentration needs to be, it needs to keep the land the same. You can't change the ecological structure or anything of that nature. So they wound up creating what's called the rule promulgation. So that means they just took this legislation and they turned it into rules, which would be the actual numeric number of 10 parts per billion. And so they had gone back through all of the various science, and they said that 10 was a safe round number. And so this is, that was sort of the background of policy. However, we're sort of now in this current state in 2022 where we're not really able to meet the 10 parts per billion standard consistently at all times. We've gotten the phosphorus levels decreased by, say, on an order of like 80 to 90%, but it's not 95%, which is what you would need. I think that we need to start asking ourselves some hard questions. And there's been some interesting sort of dynamics and trade-offs between water quality and ecosystem health and phosphorus concentration that I think are interesting. So if you look here at this graph, you'll see that ecosystem health can be, it's very complex, obviously, but let's just, for the sake of argument, say that it's a function of flow and phosphorus load. So the phosphorus load would be the flow times the concentration of phosphorus. So as flow goes up, so too does the concentration of phosphorus. And this is because there is a certain, because of the time constraints that it takes to filter out the water in the stormwater treatment areas. And so you'll have water pass through the water treatment areas, but they can only process so much within a certain area of time. So if you want more water, you're gonna have to increase the amount of phosphorus. But you can only keep the phosphorus concentration. You want to keep it low. So we're sort of caught between a rock and a hard place. So with this, as flow increases, you'll eventually sort of have the benefits from additional flow, but eventually you'll also have sort of hindrances to ecosystem health because of too much phosphorus. So there's sort of this optimization point in the middle. So there's sort of this delicate balance that needs to be struck. So when thinking about this, we sort of need to think about, okay, where are we now and where can we be? And so I think that right now we still have issues with getting enough water to the Florida Everglades, and the phosphorus levels are still well above 10 parts per billion. So we're sort of caught between a rock and a hard place here. And so originally, what was it that sort of spawned that litigation? And really what it was is it was the invasion of cattail. So one of the primary grass, it was sawgrass, and it was being replaced not by an invasive, but it wasn't an exotic invasive. It was just, it's invasive because we're changing the nutrient content of the water. So you had cattail displacing sawgrass. And so this completely changed ecological structure, going against the written legislation in 1994, the Florida Forever Act. And so, or maybe it was, I think it was actually, I think it was Everglades Forever Act. My apologies. So water quality standards are still not being met. And we're in this sort of constant tug of war between water quality and water quantity. And so there's really just not enough filtration capacity in the Everglades agriculture area, which would be the stormwater treatment areas. There's just not enough square area to filter out enough water to fulfill the needs of the Everglades. And in addition, all that water that isn't allowed to get held back accumulates in Lake Okeechobee, and consistently, the people at the South Florida Water Management District are forced to send this water to through the same through the two rivers that connected to the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic Ocean. But this water is still laden with nutrients. And so once it reaches the coastline, it creates algal blooms. So in a sense, they've sort of shifted the ecological degradation from one place to another. And that's a pretty big issue. So we sort of have trade-offs between water quality and water quantity, and geographic trade-offs between the Everglades and the Florida coastline. And so how do we balance this? There's been some attempts, but we still seem to have algal blooms every year, and the 10 parts per billion standard still seems to not get met. The other thing we need to think about is that these stormwater treatment areas, they fill up. You know, what's capturing the phosphorus? Well, vegetation. But what happens when vegetation captures it? Well, it dies, and it becomes detritus, and eventually it starts to accumulate, and eventually you're going to have to dredge it. So that's one thing that people aren't thinking about right now, is that eventually these stormwater treatment areas that costed billions of dollars to create, we're going to have to go through and dredge these out to remove this phosphorus. Now, and think about how much phosphorus that's going to release when you're taking up all this muck that's been accumulating for phosphorus for 30, 40 years. And they have a lifespan of about, I think, like 30 to 50 years. And then here's the other thing, you know, we have sea level rise. So hell, if within 100 years, if all this is underwater, did we just spend billions of dollars and for nothing?
It's a very complex problem for sure. And I'm glad that, you know, you've taken the time to write a paper that sort of outlines both the historical perspective and sort of the current situation. So I really appreciate the work that you've done, and also appreciate the time you've taken today to sort of walk us through that paper.
Yeah, and I appreciate you for having me on.